Okay, darlings, we're going to finish up our conversation about the French colonial era. I'm very sorry about the last video being cut off. My iPad ran out of storage, so we're going to try to do this a little more quickly. But let's go back and let's just kind of start over with this slide. John Law was convinced that it was necessary to import slaves because Frenchmen were simply unwilling to endure the hardships of life um, in this area with the type of farming that would need to be done and whatnot. And so the vast majority of slaves are coming in from Senegambia. In 1716, around about 500 slaves were brought to Louisiana from French colonies in the West Indies. Over the next several years, there were, again, many slaves from Africa who survived the Middle Passage and made it to the Mississippi River. By 1731, there were approximately 6,000 slaves in the colony. Most of the African slaves that landed in Louisiana, again, come from the Senegambia region, and we see a beautiful culture beginning to emerge even in the midst of such tragic circumstances within New Orleans especially. In New Orleans, at Congo Square, on market days especially, we have the enslaved mingling with one another, and they carry on their oral traditions, storytelling and whatnot, also songs and dances and everyday practices from their homeland. And this ultimately is going to provide the basis, or at least a big part of the basis, for the Afro-Creole culture, which gets passed along from generation to generation. Foods, again, like gumbo, music, specifically jazz and the blues, as well as different forms of dance we owe to this the traditions of the enslaved Africans originally brought in. In 1724, a slave code, Le Code Noir, or the Black Code, was put into effect. These series of laws was promoted by the French king, King Louis the 14th. Well, to start off with, and then we've got others. The series of laws established the legal basis of slavery. It regulated the trade of enslaved people and spelled out the rights and responsibilities of slaveholders. The code survived in one way or another throughout the entire time slavery existed in Louisiana, basically right up to the time of the Civil War. Le Code Noir granted slaves rudimentary rights, and when we say that, that's not to say like they had a Bill of Rights or Declaration of Independence or anything like that. There are just differences between the enslaved in this region and the enslaved in other regions. Underneath Le Code Noir, we do see slaves treated as persons within the Catholic Church. They were obligated to be baptized in the Catholic faith. And I would like for you to read this document. I do have it for you posted on the portal. I want you to read the document and answer the questions for our next class meeting. So please do that. During the colonial period, slaves sometimes escaped, and they would hide in swamps and bayous, sometimes in the woods right outside their plantation. And more often than not, they were referred to as maroons, M-A-R-O-O-N, a maroon. This would be like a fugitive slave. Sometimes, well, often, we have groups of maroons which would raid settlements for food or even to liberate other slaves. There were plots and conspiracies to overthrow their masters, which would be uncovered periodically. None of them were overly successful. They ultimately wouldn't accomplish much at all, except to increase fear of insurrection among whites, which of course eventually would result in harsher conditions for the enslaved. By 1810, when the first reliable U.S. Census was done, nearly 76,000 people, or according to Dr. Henry Robertson, nearly 55% of Louisiana's population were enslaved African Americans. Around about 42,000 of them lived and worked in the lands along the Mississippi River and into the Red River region. Okay. The church. The Roman Catholic Church has a huge hand in what's going on in the French colonies. It really does help shape Louisiana culture from its beginning. To start off with, there are Jesuit and Capuchin friars which come. The Jesuits, I find them just really interesting. The Jesuits believe in education as being very important for solidifying solid doctrine. But probably the most significant missionaries are the women, particularly of the Ursuline order, because they want to establish schools and hospitals, and their original mission was to educate young girls of French people that were there. But they changed that mission to instruct women and children of all ethnic backgrounds. They wanted to educate girls of color. So they changed that mission to instruct women and children of all ethnic backgrounds, and also to provide charity, hospital services, and whatnot for anyone who would come to them, but especially women and children. I apologize, I'm a little under the weather and very tired, so if I can do a better video, I will. I'll put it back up. Okay, so we were talking a little bit about John Law and about the economic bubble, the Mississippi bubble. He produces a lot of false advertising. Hey, the Mississippi's great, come on down. And so people invest lots of money very quickly, and they don't see their money, and they pull it out and da-da-da. So anyway, the investment bubble bursts, and John Law flees. He goes away. During this time, we have Bienville, who has been recalled to France over controversy and replaced by Etienne de Perrier, who did not treat Native Americans the same way as Bienville. If you'll remember, Bienville was from Canada and had a very good understanding of what of how you interacted with the Native Americans, but Perrier does not. He refuses to give the normal customary gifts, and generally makes them mad. So we have the Natchez War. The Natchez feel insulted. There's been also harsh treatment at the hands of the French. And so the Natchez attack, which definitely deals a heavy blow to the colony. Perrier retaliates violently as opposed to seeking peace. Bienville is reinstated, and he understands that's a bad idea. I mean, just we need to be seeking peace with the natives, because the Native Americans are, one, providing services and goods, as we talked about last time, but two, again, as we kind of mentioned, they're also providing a buffer zone between the French and the Spanish on one side, and between the French and the British on another. So, very important to have Native Americans working for them and not against them. So Bienville is reinstated for the last time, and he begins efforts to retake control of the river. If control of the river belongs to the British, the French are sunk, because this Louisiana colony has not really turned out exactly the way that they'd hoped, financially speaking. So Bienville, by the time he gets back, he understands that war is really the only option he has at this point in time. And so, please forgive me for the constant moving. And so he goes after the Chickasaw, who are allied to the British. When all was said and done, he requested a retirement, and Bienville was granted his request. Poor guy. And he retired to a nice, quiet life. Okay, this is our last slide for the French colonial period. After John Law leaves, as Louisiana is sort of, even though technically a financial failure, it's sort of coming into its own. We have the French and Indian War, although to Europeans this is referred to as the 7 Years' War. So if you hear either of those, you should be familiar with both. So, 1754, 7 Years' War begins. Britain and France are fighting to determine which nation is going to have total control, or at least most control, of North America. The French, of course, are in Canada. French Louisiana covered all of the Mississippi River Basin, which took a huge chunk out of the center of the North American continent. The area goes from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians, to the Great Lakes, and to New Orleans and into the Gulf. The British colonies were smaller in geographically speaking, but in population, they were actually outnumbering the French. American colonists on farms and in towns were rapidly developing their own society and culture. The differences between the Protestant British colonists and the Catholic French colonists did nothing to help what became an economic rivalry for both trade and land. Warfare was engaged on and off the first half of the 1700s between Britain and France, like on the continent. But as time passed, that struggle for money, for prestige, spills into North America. British colonists were tired of Native American attacks on their frontiers, and they wanted those rich lands in the Ohio River Valley occupied by the French. George Washington delivered a message asking the French to leave the area, but of course the French refused, and a fight got started. So in some ways we could say George Washington started the French and Indian War. The French guarded the land and their trading posts ferociously, because this is where they get, most of their exports for the mother country. This is where they're getting their furs and their pelts. If the British living alongside the Atlantic coast seized the Louisiana Territory, they might expand and push the French out of Canada as well. Indian allies of both the French and the British joined in the war, making this a frontier war marked by terrifying ambushes and horrifying massacres. Due to poor planning and ineffective leadership, the British suffered many defeats. Faced with losses, unsure about what was going to happen in the future, British military strategists worried that French populations close to New England might pose a threat. So we see the systematic expulsion of the French Acadians from Nova Scotia undertaken to assure the survival of the New England colonies. For 10 years, the Acadians kind of wandered around, and eventually many of them found a home in Louisiana, giving us the Cajun people, Cajun being short for Acadian. Meanwhile, the British sent generals to North America, and after the capture of Quebec in 1759, the tide turned, and the British start seeing more victories. In a short time, the British won the 7 Years' War and ultimately control of North America, or at least, at least in their minds. In 1762, the French knew that they were going to lose, so they started to take steps in order to lessen the blow. The French king convinced Spain to join the war on his side, but it didn't quite help. The French king thought that parts of Louisiana that didn't already belong to the British might be saved if he gave them to the Spanish. Sorry, I'm kind of wandering away from the computer screen there. The British had already seized Spanish Florida, and the French felt that Spain deserved some compensation for joining the war as France's ally. To prevent the British from obtaining all of Louisiana and to compensate Spain for its loss of Florida, the King of France gave Louisiana to the Spanish. The secret treaty of Fontainebleau granted the land west of the Mississippi River, as well as the city of New Orleans, to the Spanish. Peace negotiations and the Treaty of Paris in 1763 confirmed that Louisiana, including New Orleans, belonged to the Spanish. The rest of North America east of the Mississippi River and Canada now belonged to the British. So now Louisiana is a Spanish territory, and thus ends the French colonial period. We'll pick up next time with the Spanish and what happens with them.